This is the FAA Part 107 Remote Pilot Study Guide for 2025. In today's video, we will be discussing airport operations, air traffic patterns, runway markings and signs, ATC Communications, and much more. So get ready, because this Part 107 Study Guide starts now.
Toronto Tower, Endeavor 4819, I'm Northwest 23.
Endeavor 4819, Toronto Tower, wind 270, 23, gust 33, clear to line on 823. You might get a slight bump in the glide path, there'll be an aircraft in front of it.
Clear to land, 23, Endeavor 4819.
Now that plane crash happened just a few days ago, and some of the pilots in aviation would refer to this as a great landing. Want to know why? Because there were no fatalities. No one died. But it emphasizes the reason why the FAA wants you to know about airport operations. Imagine not knowing anything about air traffic patterns and you accidentally fly your drone into a Boeing 747. Well, realistically, that might not happen because most Boeing 747s have already been retired, but you might not be too happy when you have to go home and tell everyone what you did or did not do. So here's the breakdown of everything we'll be covering in detail on this video. Airport traffic patterns, runway markers and signs, airspace rules near airports, ATC Communications, NOTAMs and TFRs, and finally, how you can get authorization from approved FAA LAANC applications. And just so we're clear, we're not focusing on the airplane physics or load factors or a critical angle of attack. Those topics will be on the next video, 7 of 12. But what we will be discussing are terminologies used by pilots and ATC in order to achieve effective communication. Now, you had an opportunity to briefly listen to the communication between Toronto Tower and Delta Flight 4819. And if you didn't understand exactly what they were saying, well, I listened and wrote everything down for you in the ticker below. And in order to get comfortable with understanding these terminologies, you have to put yourself in an uncomfortable situation of learning. Now, this is a live feed for every single airplane in the United States, either taking off, landing, or on the ground. Can you believe it? And look at how many there are. Airports and airplanes everywhere. And in the midst of all of this congestion and confusion, there is organization. And within the foundation of organization, there is something called airport traffic patterns. And these patterns are the reason why flying on an airplane is relatively safe, despite what it is that you saw at the beginning of the video. Now, this is a live feed from Miami International Airport in Florida, and pay attention. You see that there is an airplane at the end of the runway. It is waiting there, getting ready to take off. In a minute, you're going to see it turn, but air traffic control is monitoring and will not allow that plane to have clearance until the other plane moves off of the runway and gets into the taxi area. You see how this works? Every single thing within an airport or airspace has to have proper authorization from air traffic control. And as soon as you see that plane leave the runway, then you're going to see that the other plane on the left is going to turn, line itself up on the runway, and take off into the wind so it can establish lift. And the lift is what's going to allow it to gain altitude much faster. And notice I said it's taking off into the wind. That means the wind is blowing in a westerly direction. And usually the same going against the wind takeoff procedure is the same thing that they do whenever it is that they're landing the plane against the wind also. Think about this. It's logical in thought process that if you're landing a plane against the wind, the amount of runway distance you will need will be less. Subsequently, it's the same thing for takeoff. You won't need much runway if you're flying into the wind and it's generating lift faster. Now, did you see that plane? It's taking off. It changed colors. It's now orange. That means that it will be in flight shortly. And here's a Part 107 question. What is the number of the runway that plane is using to take off? And for those of you who said runway 9 or 9er, well, you are correct. And I will have more information on this later in the video. So we're about 4.5 minutes in. Let's go ahead and start on airport traffic patterns. And by saying that, I'm going to engage you by asking a question. When you're at the drive-thru of any fast food restaurant, are you making left-hand turns or right-hand turns to get to the pay window? And you see what I just did? I just gave you a visual analogy and turned it into the answer, because you know you're sitting on the left-hand side because that's where the pay window is. Well, what do you think about airplanes and airports? Don't you think that they would follow the same analogy? Most airports have a left-hand traffic pattern for airplanes that are either landing or taking off. Listen up, boys and girls. This is one of the most important things that a remote pilot needs to understand: air traffic patterns. And why do I need to understand this, you ask? Well, I'll tell you why. These patterns help organize the flow of aircraft as they take off and land and maneuver near airports. You see, even though your drone is operating at a much lower altitude than an airplane, you must still know where the aircrafts are flying, especially when you're conducting drone operations near an airport that does not have a control tower. Did you see the face on that poor man that almost hit that 747 with his drone? Well, that won't be you because you're watching this video. Now, to avoid any confusion, there are some airports that have a right-hand pattern. We'll talk about that in a few. But I just wanted you to have a foundational understanding about what airport traffic patterns are. So now let's get into the details. Start taking notes. An airport traffic pattern, or circuit for what's used internationally, is a standard path that aircrafts follow when arriving or departing from an airport. Typically, it's used to maintain safe and orderly traffic flow. A standard airport traffic pattern will consist of the following of what they call legs: the upwind leg, the crosswind leg, the downwind leg, the base leg, and the final approach. Most small airports have a standard left-hand traffic pattern to help pilots maintain what's called situational awareness. Underline that. We're going to have to discuss that later. And this helps them to avoid collisions. This traffic pattern will be at a set altitude, which is designated by the airport. So pilots either arriving or departing know where they're supposed to be in accordance to the specific traffic pattern. Now, something very important to understand is that regardless of whether you're taking off or you're landing, you have to use what's called the upwind leg. This part of the traffic pattern is a designated flight path that runs directly parallel to the runway, and it's flown in the direction where planes usually take off. Now, I'm going to clear something up for you that used to confuse me that might be confusing you now. The word upwind and headwind have absolutely no relation. They're completely two different definitions. Upwind is in regard to relative position, in regard to a reference point. Headwind specifically refers to wind blowing in the opposite direction. So to give you the comprehensible edge, you use the upwind leg of a traffic pattern to fly into the headwind because the wind blowing in the opposite direction of the aircraft's movement affects the performance during takeoff and landing. And that's probably the best explanation I can give you. The wind that's coming towards the aircraft is allowing the aircraft aerodynamically to gain lift, to gain altitude because of the way the wings are shaped. If the wind was blowing in the opposite direction, speaking appropriately now of a tailwind, then it would be difficult for the aircraft to take off. Now, in regard to the terminology that you're going to need to understand for the Part 107 exam, here's how a standard pattern works. Now, this is what's called a left-hand traffic pattern. Do you notice at the very top that you see the direction of the wind? And at that same direction, the path is called the downwind leg. And you need to pay attention to this one because it's going to be on the Part 107 exam. Here's the question. If an aircraft is flying parallel to the runway opposite the landing direction, which leg is the aircraft currently on? That is a typical Part 107 question, and the answer is the downwind leg. And I just put you one question away from getting your certificate. Now notice that there's an entry point that puts you on the downwind leg, and what you need to know is that this is a standard entry point, and that entry point will always be at a 45-degree angle. Write that down. Most aircrafts will enter a standard traffic pattern at a 45-degree angle to the downwind leg. This is what the FAA recommends, and this method is used because it allows the pilots to integrate smoothly into the traffic flow. Also, it allows the pilots to see other aircrafts clearly because they're on the left-hand side, just like at the drive-thru. It basically provides a controlled way to merge into traffic without any safety concerns. And also, there's something that's not really discussed too often, but this does offer a level of what's called predictability that everyone knows what to expect. There is on the downwind leg a 45-degree entry point, so you expect that other aircrafts will be merging in at that point. Now, something I want you to understand reasonably, logically, and theoretically. Nothing's perfect and nothing is set in stone here. There are some situations where an aircraft cannot enter at a 45-degree angle, and it could be due to a variety of reasons, such as the terrain will not allow a 45-degree entry, or there may be airspace restrictions, or there may be ATC instructions that do not allow the aircraft to make that maneuver. These things happen. So in those situations, there is another type of entry point called a midfield entry. And this approach allows an aircraft on the opposite side of the pattern to cross over the airport at midfield before descending and making a turn or maneuver to join the downwind leg. And there are some other non-standard entry points, such as the straight-in approach and the overhead entry military style, but we'll talk about all that in another video. The most important thing for you to understand for the exam is the downwind leg and at what angle the entry point is. Now let's talk about the next leg of this traffic pattern, and that is the base leg. And you can see that we're referring to an airplane that is descending, right? Isn't that clear? So the base leg of this left-hand traffic pattern will always be a 90-degree turn from downwind that brings the aircraft closer to the runway. That's as simple as it gets, and you can see that we're still continuously making left-hand turns, right? The base leg of an airport traffic pattern is what will bring the aircraft closer to what's called the final approach. And in this case, it will be another left-hand 90-degree turn, so that way the aircraft can line up with the runway and get ready for landing. And at this moment is when the aircraft is now making a gradual descent so it can touch down on the runway. So to recap this traffic pattern for an aircraft arriving at the airport, there will always be a 45-degree entry point, then traveling downwind, making a 90-degree turn at the base leg, and then the final approach descending onto the runway. And remember what we discussed earlier, the final approach and then finally getting onto the runway, that direction will always be upwind. It is much easier to land an aircraft when the wind is coming at you, just the same as it's easier to take off whenever it is that you're flying into the wind to generate lift. Now, the last thing I need to mention here is about aircrafts that are departing the runway. We have not mentioned exactly what traffic pattern they'll be taking once they are off the runway. So do you see that once the aircraft has departed and gained a certain amount of altitude, that it's going to follow a certain direction? In this case, it's going to be either left or going straight on, right? But here's the thing. If an airport has a standard left-hand traffic pattern, departing flights will typically turn left after takeoff unless instructed otherwise. Now, I have to put a sectional chart up on the screen because I have to take all of the information that you have so far in your head and relate that information to what it is that you're going to be seeing on a sectional chart. Putting everything together in your head that is relatable is what is going to give you what I call informational continuity. That's what's going to allow you to connect the information. So we're looking at a sectional chart right now, and on the screen you're looking at Washington Dulles International Airport. And right now we're still focusing on airport traffic patterns. I'm looking for information that's going to provide me with airport traffic patterns for Dulles International Airport. And what's so surprising is that I don't see anything. I don't even see runway numbers, or should I say runway designations. Why is that? Shouldn't we be asking that question? Well, let me explain something to you so it can clear up a certain level of confusion. High activity airports often exclude runway numbers. Have you ever heard that mentioned in any other tutorial? I bet the answer is no. You've never heard that before. Well, I'm going to explain it. Dulles International Airport, there's no designation for runways. There's no pattern indication such as RP or LP. There's nothing here. Los Angeles, LAX, no indication of runway designations. RP, LP is not displayed on this informational block for this airport. The only information that's provided is the length of the runways, and the letter L stands for lighting, so there's lighting on the runway. John F. Kennedy International, JFK. These are some big airports. So quickly, let me explain. Large commercial airports like Dulles, JFK, LAX, they do not include runway numbers on sectional charts because the pilots use their own official charts. The pilots already have the detailed information about the runways, and all of these runways have ATC controlled operations, meaning that the pilots will receive specific instructions on runway assignments from air traffic control. Now look over to the right of JFK. You're going to see Republic FRG. This is a busy airport. It's a general Seattle Aviation Airport in Farmingdale, New York, Long Island. I used to live there. It's about 30 miles east of Manhattan. I'll tell you about it later. But anyway, do you see that this airport has an RP, then a number 1, then comma, 32? What does that mean? Do you know? Well, let me tell you. Whenever you see RP in the information block at the bottom and then numbers after it, for example, 1, 32, that means that both runway 1 and runway 32 follow a right-hand traffic pattern. And if I pull in a little more, you can see the runway symbol on the sectional chart. At the very top, you'll see runway number 1, and to the right of that, I'm pointing to runway 32. You know this from what you've already learned, so add the 0 and make runway 1 10 degrees and then runway 32 320 degrees. So look at the information block again. RP 1, 32 means that both of these runways have right-hand traffic patterns. Now, here's a question I'm going to make you think a little bit. Are there any other runways at Republic Airport? Well, let's do this. Raise your left-hand traffic pattern if the answer is yes. Now, raise your right-hand traffic pattern if the answer is no. For those of you who raised your left hand, you are correct. The answer is yes. And the reason for that is because runways are designated by compass coordinates. The one at the very top is at 10 degrees, and the other one to the right of that at the top is at 320 degrees. But there are also 2 at the bottom. And one is runway 14 at 140 degrees, and the other is runway 19 at 190 degrees. And since runways 14 and 19 do not have RP as a designation, and there's nothing listed in regard to these 2 runways, it is assumed that both of these runways follow a left-hand traffic pattern. Now let's go back to Dulles International Airport to clarify something that I mentioned earlier. There are no references in regard to runway information or traffic pattern information here, but you can visually surmise that 3 of those runways are exactly the same coordinates, and also the assigned designation of those runways will also include center, left, and right. And I'll be explaining more about this later on in the video. But what I want you to know is that there is a reason why Dulles International does not publish the traffic patterns on sectional charts. And that's because all traffic is directed by air traffic control. So VFR, or visual flight rule traffic patterns, are not used. Commercial airliners don't follow typical standard traffic patterns because they follow the assignments from air traffic control in regard to approaches and departures instead of the classic or traditional left and right traffic patterns that you're familiar with in these smaller airports. This is extremely important and valuable information that I've just given you. You need to pay attention to those specific indicators on a sectional chart that are in the information block of an airport. Now, the other option that you see here is what's called a straight out departure. This refers to an aircraft taking off and continuing on course parallel to the airport runway without making any immediate turns after takeoff. This is allowed only under certain conditions. 1, when air traffic patterns allow it, and 2, when air traffic control has given clearance. Pilots will use the straight out departure when they need to gain a certain amount of altitude before actually making a turn. And remember earlier that you underlined what's called situational awareness, didn't you? Well, for straight out departures, which may appear to be a safe bet, it's even more imperative for pilots to have situational awareness and to monitor the surroundings of the aircraft, especially when the airspace is busy. And I know that you've all been waiting patiently for me to finally talk about crosswind, and I was holding back for a reason. Let me tell you why. The crosswind leg is utilized by both arriving and departing aircraft within a traffic pattern. And this is all going to make sense to you right now. You see, when an aircraft takes off in the upwind leg, it will climb while maintaining the runway heading. And once it reaches a specified altitude, in this case the crosswind altitude, it will turn into the crosswind leg and enter into the traffic pattern. And once in the traffic pattern, the pilot now has options. The aircraft can either continue outbound for a straight out departure after the crosswind leg, or there's the option to turn left into the downwind leg and then continue out from there. Now, I have to tell you, I am an advocate of higher thinking. Whoever thought about this was a genius. You know why? It's because if there was a situation where the plane had to make an emergency landing, well, guess what? They're already in the traffic pattern. All they have to do is take the base leg and line up for final approach and land the plane. So there are 5 things here: the upwind leg, the crosswind leg, the downwind upwind leg, the base leg, and the final approach. Look over your notes and take a quick break. Now let's talk about airport markers and signs. And no, I'm not referring to the ones that you're already familiar with inside of the airport. I'm talking about the ones outside of the airport that you're not familiar with. And believe it or not, yes, you do have to know this information for the exam also. So let's start with runways, and consider this. Runways are not just pavement. They are a detailed, complex system of numbers, lines, and signs that keep pilots safe. Understanding this particular area decreases the learning curve and helps you to read and understand sectional charts, to identify restricted areas, and also, more importantly, it allows you to pass a Part 107 exam with confidence. So since we're flying over these runways, let's talk about them. Do you remember in one of my earlier videos, I mentioned that runway headings are designated by compass settings? And if you were observant, you noticed that we just flew over a set of numbers 26. And I want you to remember this forever. When you see a set of numbers on a runway, unlike sectional charts where we had to add 2 zeros, airports you only add 1. So this 26 actually is 260 degrees. And 260 degrees on a compass actually puts you in a westerly direction. Basically, all airport runways have numbers, and those numbers coincide with compass settings by degrees. Now here's a little quick question. What happens if you have parallel runways all pointing in the same direction and all at 360 degrees? And a lot of people don't even know that those runways will have an additional identifier. For example, L for left, C for center, and R for right. So the markings will be 36 left, 36 center, and 36 right. And a perfect example of that is KLAX Los Angeles Airport, where there is runway 24L and runway 24R. For the Part 107 exam, you will be asked a question such as this: what does the number on the runway indicate? And I just gave you the answer to that question. So the correct answer is the number on the runway indicates the runway's magnetic heading, and it's rounded to the nearest 10 degrees. Now there's one more question I need to ask you, and for those of you who watched my other videos, you already know how to answer this question, so here it is. If an airplane has been instructed to land on runway 18, what direction will the plane be traveling? Now, I'm not going to answer that question, but if you're having trouble, you can shoot me a comment and I will answer that question for you. Just kidding, I'll give you the correct answer now. For 18 degrees, you should add 1 0 and make it 180 degrees. Then look on your compass and see 180 degrees is south. And understand that if the plane is landing on runway 18, then it is heading south. And that's the answer. Anytime a plane is landing on a runway, the number on the runway will always indicate the compass direction that the plane is heading towards. And correspondingly, if the plane has been given instructions to take off, the number on the runway that it is utilizing corresponds to the compass heading by degrees. So just so I know that you're super sharp, ready for this exam, I'm going to give you another question, but this time you have to think about this question because you're not going to be able to answer it immediately. And as you already know, this question is on the Part 107 exam. Here it is. You are monitoring CTAF frequency at a local airport, and you hear the pilot say that he is left downwind of runway 16. What is the heading of the aircraft? Now, the first thing that this question is doing is giving you information about the direction of the runway by degrees. You heard the pilot say left downwind of runway 16. That alone is giving you a mental orientation of where the aircraft is heading. And what might be confusing you is the same thing that was confusing me in the beginning, and that is, what does left downwind of runway mean? So let's dissect it. Left means that the pilot can see the airport from the left window. And just like the drive-through, that means he's going to be making left-hand turns so he can eventually land the plane. That also means that anyone at the airport who is facing the direction of runway 16 can see the pilot's aircraft on the left. Pretty cool, huh? Now let's dissect downwind. The downwind leg will always be running parallel to the airport runway, going in the other direction. And all you need to figure out now is the heading of the aircraft by either degrees or direction. That's easy. What is the opposite of 160 degrees or the opposite of southeast? And for those of you who are still trying to figure it out, I'll make it really easy for you. You can find the opposite direction of something simply by adding 180 degrees to it. So take 160 degrees, add 180 degrees. That gives you the direction of the aircraft at 340 degrees. That means the aircraft is traveling northwest. And I just gave you another Part 107 question to get closer to that 100% score. So are we clear? Do you have any more questions about airport traffic patterns? Well, if you do, shoot me a comment comment, I'll answer your question. Next up, airport signs and runway markings. Now understand that there are a lot of signs and markings at airports, but we're going to creatively condense the information so that way you'll be able to retain it much easier. So let's look at this image with a sign at the airport. Now, to break this down, a black sign with yellow letters is specifically a taxiway location sign. It tells the pilots which taxiway they're currently on. For example, let's say you are the pilot in command right now and passengers are boarding your aircraft. Once they've boarded, air traffic control tells you that you're able to use runway 22 left. Well, do you think you're going to start pushing buttons and pulling levers so you can drive the aircraft to some runway and you don't even know how to get there? That's pretty scary considering that you're operating a $250 million aircraft. Air traffic control will also instruct you to use Delta 7 or D7 taxiway to get to runway 22 left. And you will see these signs on the taxiway guiding you to runway 22 left. These signs with yellow letters and black backgrounds are telling you where you are on the taxiway. The pilots will usually have a chart or a map that tells them exactly where to go, and they'll keep that open while they're taxiing. Now this takes us to these red signs with the white letters. And what does the color red psychologically signify to you? Well, I guess that answer might be different for everyone because it could mean money, right? But not at an airport. These signs are important, just like the red light at a traffic signal, and they're called mandatory instruction signs. These signs are critical for safety because they indicate areas where pilots must stop unless cleared by air traffic control. You can't just waltz that $250 million airplane past that sign without proper clearance. These colors are in place psychologically for a reason. Red means stop until you're cleared by ATC. Now you will find these signs on runways, critical areas, and restricted zones. And they're set up to ensure that aircrafts do not enter active runways or protected areas without proper clearance. Now I know the way I just explained that to you that you will not forget that on the Part 107 exam. And also remember that these signs are placed at the runway entrance where the taxiway comes to an end. Now here's a perfect example so you can maintain a visual impression. Do you see how that plane came to a stop just before that mandatory instructional sign? Well, there's another reason why that plane came to a stop, and those are the yellow lines that are directly in front of it. Now those lines are called hold short lines, and you'll know that it's a hold short line because it will have two solid yellow lines and two dashed yellow lines. What this means is that any aircraft on a taxiway approaching a hold short line must come to a stop or hold before crossing. Now think about this. You're in your car driving and you want to pass a car that's in front of you, but you can't because of two solid yellow lines that are in the lane, right? What do you need to do before you can pass that vehicle? You need to wait until it turns into a dashed yellow line. Am I correct? And guess where this analogy is going? That plane was on a taxiway and it approached a double yellow line. That means it needs to hold short and it cannot proceed until it gets clearance from air traffic control. Now on the flip side, let's suppose that that plane was coming in the other direction and approached the dashed yellow lines. Well, guess what? If it's a dashed yellow lines, it can still continue and does not have to hold and does not need ATC clearance or authorization. Now, did I just paint that impression into your head just like Bob Ross? On the Part 107 exam, they will give you a description, two solid yellow lines and two dashed lines, and then from the multiple choice answers, you will have to pick the one that represents what they described in the question. Now, for the three things that I just explained to you, you're going to have to understand the logical order. First, it's the taxiway, then it's the hold short line, then it's the mandatory instruction sign, and then comes the runway. And following these airport signs and markers all come under the direction of air traffic control. And now that you know what's expected when you're trying to get onto a runway, how about some signs when you're trying to exit or get off of a runway? The yellow signs with black letters can be called either taxi exit signs or runway exit signs. They provide critical information for pilots about where to exit the runway after landing or during taxiing. And the psychological reason why these signs are so bright is because the yellow background with the black letters make it easily visible to understand in various conditions. So whenever you see these bright yellow signs with black letters, it's a way to get off of something or to exit something. And another way for you to remember this for the Part 107 exam is that they always have an arrow showing you where you need to go to exit, or they can also be used as a sign to guide the pilots to a specific or designated location. Now, I've just put up the Airport Sign Systems reference chart. This is also available in your Airman's Knowledge Testing Supplement. It will be figure 65 on section 2 of 62. And you know, it's a good idea for you to go over the information by yourself and really study it, because you never know in regard to this Part 107 what's coming next. Wow. And I wonder how many people made it out of that one. This accident, the way it occurred, is called a runway incursion. And if there's one thing that's preventable at an airport, it will be an incursion on either a runway or a taxiway. Now, the massive incursion that you just saw may have been a simulation, but this near miss happened today at Chicago Midway Airport. Watch this.
Center, select 560. Which is 560 negative. Cross runway 31 left, hold short runway 31 center.
See how you now understand the terminology? ATC just told that little plane to hold short of runway 31 center. The only reason why these things happen is because someone did not get proper clearance from air traffic control before crossing a certain area. And this takes us to airport rules, and I'm going to briefly go over them so that way you understand exactly what's expected of the pilots in regard to safety and reliability of an airport. And one of the first rules is taxiing procedures. You see, pilots must follow specific instructions when taxiing, and this includes adhering to all the markings and the signs that we just went over. Another rule is in regard to what we just saw, runway and taxiway incursions. Pilots need to be vigilant to avoid these type of incursions, and this includes remaining at the holding positions until they have proper ATC clearance. Another rule is takeoff and landing protocols, making sure that you're adhering to the traffic patterns, also spacing, timing, and communication with air traffic control. Also, there are air traffic control communication protocols. Clear communication with ATC and other ground personnel is crucial. Pilots must use standard terminology when communicating by using phonetics and phrasing appropriately, so that way there's no confusion. You heard the communication that was happening between Toronto Tower and Delta Flight 1849. It's crucial that standard communication is established at all times when it comes to air traffic control. Another thing that you may not be aware of is that pilots also need to adhere to what's called noise abatement procedures. These are specific rules that are established to minimize noise pollution in surrounding areas by having the pilots maneuver their aircraft towards designated routes. And last rule, adherence to signage. Pilots and ground crews must follow all airport signs, including markings, runways, taxiways, and holding areas to ensure safe operations. Extremely useful information here I'm giving you, so that way you don't have any unexpected surprises like what we just saw when it's time for you to take your Part 107 exam. Okay, let's talk briefly now about NOTAMs and TFRs. First, what is a NOTAM and what does it do? Well, a NOTAM stands for Notice to Air Missions. It used to stand for Notice to Airmen. You still hear that now. But in December of 2021, the FAA changed it from Notice to Airmen to Notice to Air Missions. These are official advisories that are issued by the aviation authorities to alert pilots of temporary or time-sensitive changes that may affect the safety of your flight. Now, these NOTAMs should be incorporated as a core part of your pre-flight procedures. Now, some of these include, for example, runway closures, temporary air restrictions, navigational aid outages, or even a flock of birds. This is important information, and you'll want to know exactly how to get this information before you fly. Now, this is funny, or maybe not so funny. Do any of you remember January 11th of 2023? There was an FAA NOTAM system outage that caused a nationwide ground stop in the United States, temporarily halting all domestic departures. And get this, over 11,000 flights were either delayed or canceled all across the United States. From what I remember, an incorrect data file corrupted the entire system. It was the first nationwide ground stop since 9/11, but fortunately, the same day, the FAA fixed the corrupted file and restored the system. And this is important information also, but what's the most important is how do you get a hold of these NOTAMs and where do you go to get them? Well, don't worry, I've got the answer. There are 4 ways that you can get them. The first one is to call 1-800-WX-BRIEF. There you're going to speak to someone called a briefer, and they're going to give you information about what's going on in your specific area. The next way is to go online, and you can see what I have on my screen and in the video description where you need to go to actually obtain the information online. Now, the last way is if you go directly to the website at 1-800-WXBrief.com. Now, I'll try to remember to put everything in the video description, but if I forget, just send me a comment and I'll be happy to put it in there for you. The last thing I want to mention in this section is TFR. Now, what exactly is a TFR? Well, it stands for Temporary Flight Restriction, and it's issued by the FAA to restrict or control aircraft operations in a specific area for safety or security concerns. A perfect example of that is when you have what's called a VIP movement. For example, the President of the United States or some other profile official that's traveling in that area. Another good example would be a major event such as the Super Bowl or some large public gathering, an air show or a military operation or a hazardous situation such as a chemical spill or even a wildfire where the aircrafts have to stay clear of the firefighters' operations. These are all reasons why a temporary flight restriction would be issued. And you can find out about these TFRs simply by going to tfr.faa.gov. Now, there's one very serious thing I need to tell you that may have serious consequences if you violate a TFR. You want to make sure that you're not flying anywhere near a temporary flight restriction, because that could lead to either suspension or revocation of your license, but worse, you could be facing civil or criminal penalties, and that may mean that you ain't going to be flying no more. Now I'm going to give you the lowdown about LAANC authorization. And it's funny I said lowdown because LAANC actually stands for Low Altitude Authorization and Notification Capability. It's a system that allows drone operators to receive real-time airspace authorizations for flying in controlled airspace. This is important to know because a lot of you are flying in controlled airspace and you don't even know that you're in controlled airspace. And then again, you know that you're in controlled airspace, but you don't know how to get the proper authorization. This is very important. How do you expect to run a commercial drone operation as a certified remote pilot if you don't know how to get proper LAANC authorization from ATC? Well, I'm going to do my best to explain this to you in detail so when that time comes, you won't have any issues or concerns. Now, giving you a little history here for those of you who remember, before the implementation of LAANC, drone operators had to follow a more manual, time-consuming process in order to obtain airspace authorization for flying in controlled airspace. Believe me, it took a while, and those manual applications had to be submitted 90 days before you even wanted to fly that thing. The way it was processed before, the FAA would receive your request, and then it would take days or even weeks, depending on the complexity of your operation, or even if they had a volume of applications that were just overloading them. It was difficult to have this thing done quickly. And what was compounding the frustration even more was the inconsistency with the different FAA offices and ATC facilities. They would have different responses. But something wonderful happened on October 2nd, 2017. A system was developed by the FAA in collaboration with a private company to streamline the process of obtaining airspace authorization for drone operators in controlled airspace. That system was called LAANC. And in 2019, just 2 years later, mobile applications were developed, so now you can get authorization almost instantaneously on your smartphone. And remember, the apps that you will be downloading must be approved by the FAA, so I will have a list of a few applications that work extremely well. In many cases, for operations that are below 400 feet, you're going to see that the authorization will come back almost instantly, making it quicker and easier for remote pilots to comply with FAA regulations. Now, there are some restrictions and requirements. In order for you to be eligible to use LAANC, drone operators must hold a remote pilot certificate issued by the FAA and comply with all relevant regulations, including Part 107. This is why passing this Part 107 exam is so important, because it gives you extra and added benefits. Your ability to fly in areas where there are restrictions or limitations is reduced, and you can enjoy the privilege of flying a drone commercially. That's all I have for this video. My brain battery is just about depleted. Next week, we'll have 7 of 12 being uploaded. You don't want to miss that one. Airplane dynamics, loading, also critical angle of attack. A lot of fun stuff to talk about. We will see you on the next one. Stay tuned.